I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
We're going to go ahead and kick off the third session of the day. My name is Susan Winckler, and I serve as President and CEO of the Food and Drug Law Institute. And I have the honor of moderating your next panel. We heard in the last session a discussion of the ground-up technology development, and now we're going to move to a specific discussion on FDA regulation in the digital world. We are going to engage in a similar format to the prior panel, what I call a moderated dialogue. We are going to have opening remarks from each of our distinguished panelists on how FDA and regulated industry can or should better incorporate new technology into the drug development process. And then we'll move into a robust discussion among the panelists and with each of you. So you are going to hear from, first, Crenshaw, who's providing the perspective of regulated industry as Vice President of Eli Lilly's oncology business, the oncology business unit. Then you'll hear from Marty Kohn, who provides the perspective of those engaged in supporting healthcare and changing healthcare through business and health analytics at IBM Research. And then our final opening salvo will come from Vicki Seyfert Margolis, who provides the perspective of a former regulator, former academic, former and current disruptor, and current contributor to health via Precision for Medicine. So, Newt, would you kick us off?
Sure, I'd be pleased to. So I'll speak to three things in my opening comments. First, I want to share some data from a survey that Lilly recently sponsored in concert with our initiative called PACE, which is Patient Access to Cancer Care Excellence. I want to speak a bit about some principles for FDA reform, building upon some of the comments we heard earlier today from Peter, and also looking at some of the progress that's been made and make a few comments there. So first, with regards to a 6-country survey that we recently did, the data suggests that we're at a moment here where the public, as was exemplified by our earlier panel, is ahead of where policy and regulators are. And let me share a few interesting facts with you from this 6-country, multi-hundreds of people, patients and caregivers. 80% believe that the biologic makeup of individuals can predict their response to treatment. These are our patients. 3/4 want to be tested for personalized options. 8 out of 10 believe that faster progress against cancer depends on greater cooperation between government, academia, industry, and NGOs. Here we sit. And lastly, 9 out of 10 say that despite privacy concerns, they would be willing to share their own medical records and test results for research purposes. It's interesting that we have a public that is primed and ready to make this happen, and we see so many startups that are indicative of that. We need to catch up. Having said that, some principles that we would espouse for FDA reform would be fourfold. And these general principles are ones that we can delve into. But if we're going to have a state-of-the-art regulatory system that is going to catch up with both science and increasingly public sentiment and the desire of patients, the agency needs to be first predictable. Those who deal with them need to understand that there are rules that we can come to expect, and it cannot be capricious. It needs to be consistent, transparent, and scientifically rigorous. And I would say that on the latter piece, we heard great data today and information around the need for that scientific rigor to really be in keeping with the biologic basis of disease. And certainly in the division that I run within Lilly, that's a reality today in cancer. As we've heard numerous examples, it may still be a ways off for other diseases, but it is here and now for us. I will state that the FDA is making some progress through negotiations with industry and others. PDUFA 5, FDASIA have begun to make some steps towards moving in the direction we need them to. It's just not fast enough. And I'll comment on a couple of things. First off, in the recent regulation in FDASIA, there's the opportunity for a risk-benefit grid to be put into place. And this is a very powerful way to begin to array the various amounts of data that may bring to bear in terms of decisions they make, contextual information to provide a different perspective. I'm reminded of the technologist Alan Kay, who famously stated that perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And sometimes we need to take those regulators and give them a fresh perspective so that they may see things in light of where patients are seeing them and get them back in the center of the work that is being done. The last piece, or next piece, would be around post-marketing surveillance and just the need to not only assent industry with the regulator to monitor safety, which we know we must need to if we're going to have quicker approvals, but also to be looking at signal detection for efficacy and to ensure that this occurs in a balanced way, again, with a risk-benefit management, not some type of avoidance. And it leads me to a comment that we spoke about last night at dinner, but I think is important with the regulator. At a fundamental leadership level, we need to change the incentives. If you're a person who works for the agency, and these are people who probably get up every morning and want to try to do the right thing, I think we need to, in the midst of criticizing maybe where they are from a policy standpoint, realize that there are folks there at the agency, as Andy said last night at dinner, just as there are in our big companies and small companies who really want to do the right thing for the patient. They've gotten into the business they've chosen for a noble cause. We need to change those incentives, because if you think that you make a mistake by approving a drug and there's a safety concern that arises later on, and you're going to be hauled up before Congress and excoriated there, it does tend to change your perspective. And so can these risk-benefit grids, can our abilities to quantify the cost to society of not approving these agents more quickly, can this become more part of the conversation so that people can act on that data, not just on the downside associated with some safety concern that may come at a later point? And so I'll close by just saying that I stand before you as a pharmaceutical executive, so I know if any of you have seen the Far Side cartoon by Gary Larson, where there were two bears standing next to one another in the woods, and one of the bears had this bullseye sort of imbued into his fur, and the other one looked at him and said, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal." I know that I have that birthmark to suggest that easily criticized Big Pharma, but I will say this to you, that at Lilly and in our Lilly Oncology division, we are striving day in, day out in our discovery, drug development, and our commercial operations to put the patient in the center of everything we do. We recognize that is our mission. We make money as a consequence of doing that well. Okay, an intended consequence to be sure, because we're publicly held and shareholders have a say in it. But you need to fundamentally know that that is the case. And I stand before you not just as a pharmaceutical executive, but as a cancer survivor. So I understand what that looks like. I've been through the system. I've also been a caregiver for another cancer patient, my father, who actually passed away 1 year ago today. So it's the anniversary of his passing. So I have an acute appreciation for both the possibility of targeted medicine, because he and I both benefited from those 8 types of agents, and also the great need to make progress, both in terms of molecular medicine, but also the healthcare system, and ways that we can connect an inherently multidisciplinary and often fragmented approach to treating patients, where unfortunately often the patient isn't the center of what goes on. And so with that, I'll close.
That's great, Newton. And I think if I could echo back to you a few of the key points I heard you say is that it's time to harness the public sentiment and engagement, that the public is moving ahead of us. that you're looking for a predictable regulator, but not a petrified regulator, so one that has flexibility and the right incentives, and then that we are perhaps in this era where we have the opportunity to expand post-market surveillance to look not only at safety but efficacy. Does that capture it?
Very well summarized.
Okay, great. Marty?
Thank you. I think one thing I've learned from various public presentations is be careful who you follow. I wish I had preceded Newton. It would have made it a little easier.
Hey, I'm last.
Okay. So my role is I'm chief medical scientist at IBM Research. I work in the area of health analytics, working with managing and using information. So before I speak any further, let me give you a couple of caveats. First of all, many of the ideas I will express are not endorsed by IBM. Sort of like an infomercial on TV does not necessarily represent the opinions of the broadcasting agency. And also additional perspective, my ideas tend to be a little different. The way my colleagues express it technically is my closest association with artificial intelligence is that my intelligence is completely artificial. And also, my thoughts are formed by my background, which is fairly eclectic. I started off as an academic research biomedical engineer, working in information content and pattern recognition in medical signals. Also practiced emergency medicine for more than 30 years. I've been a healthcare executive and spent a couple of years as a health policy advisor for a congressman. So I look at things fairly globally, and that's part of what came out of emergency medicine, because in emergency medicine you don't succeed unless the entire healthcare system around you is succeeding. So when I look at regulation and the role of technology in the broader scheme of things, a few things is we need to look at regulation in that broader scheme of what do we envision healthcare to be in the future. And we have a few goals for that. One is that healthcare is more personalized. Perhaps precision medicine is one of the manifestations of that. We want to be able to make decisions that are more specifically likely to be of benefit for an individual person. Now, the genomic community has sort of taken that on as if they've created that idea. That's not true. The first reference to personalized medicine that I recall was my first year of medical school. There was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, 1968, called Individualized Healthcare. And it probably predated that. So the idea of being able to make personalized decisions is not new. But our environment has changed. That was a great goal back then, but it was not achievable. We didn't understand it well enough. We didn't have the information base for it well enough. So now we're in the position of being able to do it. And we are challenged by systems that existed in the concept of 1968 when we had these ideas but didn't know how to go about them. So the first time I was involved in a controlled study was when I was in elementary school, and I was in the control group for the test of the Salk vaccine. It's doubly frustrating. One is I had to get the 3 injections and then I had to go back and get them again because I was in the control group. It was fairly simplistic. Did it prevent polio? Did it not? Didn't worry about genomics. It was quite clear. We're not in that arena anymore, and things are much more complex. So one of the things I think we have to understand is the technology for managing information, for analyzing information, is not the limiting step here. We have that technology. And if we need more sophisticated technology 2 years from now, we will develop it. So we at IBM have technology that can do population observational analytics, comparative effectiveness analytics. We can search through millions of pages of literature to find information that's out there that may help you make decisions for your patients and provide that information to patients. That's not the limitation. What we need to do is, if we keep in mind the goals of the future of personalized healthcare, economically efficient healthcare, avoiding the waste and unnecessary. Recent article by Don Berwick that was in JAMA, depending on the assumptions you make, 15 to 45% of what we spend on healthcare is for things of no value. We have to put things in that broader perspective, and then know where we want to go and define the pathways for what we want to be. Now, it was mentioned, that a lot of patients, are interested in sharing their information. They want to be part of these studies because they're going to get some benefit from that. That unfortunately is not a uniform concept. This past January, a Virginia state senator submitted a resolution, a bill to the Virginia Assembly prohibiting the use of healthcare information for analytics. Not saying you have to guard privacy and security, just prohibiting the use of healthcare information for analytics. So we have some political and social obstacles to overcome. So technology, the technology even that we have developed is not the solution per se. If we know where we want to go and we have defined the obstacles that are in our way, and then technology is an enabler to help us overcome the obstacles. So from my perspective, and admittedly, IBM would probably disown this, knowing where we want to go, what we have to do, what we have to change, acknowledging the environment in which we live and where we want it to be in the future is the real challenge. Since you mentioned a cartoon, there's a cartoon I use in some of my talks to demonstrate the idea that technology itself is not the solution. The image is somebody hanging onto a cliff by his fingers. He's off the cliff, hanging on by his fingers, and then somebody at the top of the cliff said, "Don't worry, technology will save you." Okay, that's the wrong approach. So we do work with information now. I'm fortunately in the position of assuming the information exists because I have very bright colleagues who make sure that that information exists to address these issues. So if we're looking at changing to the future, our world has changed. The amount of information we have has changed. We're in the big data environment. We have transitioned from the programmatic computational age to the cognitive computational age. Most of us grew up in the programmatic age where you program the computer to use a specific set of data that you also entered into the computer to come up with a solution that you anticipated. We're no longer there. The big data alone doesn't let us work that way. Big data is sometimes characterized by 4 V's: volume, velocity, how quickly it's coming at you, variety, all the different kinds of data, and veracity. When you get big data, a lot of it's inconsistent or, in fact, incorrect. You need to work through all that. So that requires us to look at things differently, which may mean our whole method for doing studies may have to change. The strictly set up double-blind randomized controlled study with your initial and null hypothesis may in fact not apply or be the best way to do things in the future. If we don't understand all the possible interactions, all the possible confusions, all the possible confounding variables, what drugs the patient is on, their genomics, other things about their environment, then studies that don't involve an initial hypothesis, that are just looking for patterns in megabytes or terabytes of data, may be a different concept that we have to approach. And so I think the technology is there when we're ready to use it, but we really have to fundamentally understand how we want to go about it, how we're going to collect the information, what we want the information to show us, and how that's going to contribute to our future vision of healthcare before technology has a role.
So Marty, if I heard you correctly, you're pointing out that we are headed, we at least know where we're headed or know where it is that we want to go, and technology will help us get there, but there are a lot of other things that have to come along with that if that's the information that's then available to be analyzed and then rethinking perhaps how we move to the future.
I think that's part of it, but from the discussion since last night and today is, we've heard a range of views of what people would like regulation to do and to be. Mm-hmm. So we need to refine that. We can't track 14 different objectives necessarily. So we need to focus that. And again, I think it'll only be successful if we put it in the context of the entirety of the goal for transforming healthcare and not look at regulation in isolation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Vicki.
Well, I am last, so it's hard to follow those two. I feel like what I'm going to try to do is address some of what was discussed, but I want to start with 2 things that I think shape my perspective. Firstly, I'm an immunologist, and when you train as an immunologist, you like to think in terms of systems and interactions and how things work together and patterns. And you also have a significant amount of skepticism around the power of genetics. And the reason that we as immunologists have had the skepticism around that is because for years and years and years, we've known a lot about immune genetics. In fact, immunogenetics was like one of the toughest classes I took when I entered graduate school, because we were dealing with inbred mouse strains and HLA polymorphism for years. I don't want to really say how long ago it was, but for years. And when we still look at where the majority of immune-mediated disease is coming from, we can track it back to this very complex locus, namely HLA, and sort of everything else dwarfs in comparison. Similarly, when we look at diseases of the immune system, I worked for an extensive period of time in multiple sclerosis clinical trials, type 1 diabetes clinical trials, rheumatoid arthritis clinical trials, and we look at identical twin concordance. It's less than overwhelming, somewhere around 30 to 40%. So clearly, there are other things that I think we need to capture, and I fear that the enthusiasm, and I don't want to say I'm not enthusiastic about the Human Genome Project in genetics, because I am, and I think it has a lot to contribute. But I think the enthusiasm has suffered from maybe a little bit of overhype in terms of what we're promising and then what the public and what the people at point of care are actually realizing. And that what they're actually realizing at point of care is also very dependent on where they're receiving their care. Whether they're receiving their care here in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering, or whether they're receiving their care at a community hospital in, Mississippi, not to pick on Mississippi. So we just have to recognize that there's a huge disconnect between the power of what we talk about in these meetings and the reality on the ground for so many people who I speculate are the vast majority of patients that we're talking about. So I just want to introduce that. As a concept that we need to think about what I call the two healthcare systems that exist when we think about this map for where we're going. And I personally think that we're hearing voices of patients from a layer of that healthcare, but not a vast majority of people, many of whom who don't know what the human genome is. So, and I have other focus group data on that we could talk about. But I think that's an important point. Secondly, in sort of this world of systems, I spent 2 years at the FDA thinking hard about, and I want to say that if I could contribute to Peter's utilization of President Obama in a positive sense, then I feel like I've made a vast accomplishment as part of the PCAST study leadership. But in any case, the genesis of PCAST in part was that we spent a lot of time, this is the commissioner and I, looking at the system and what we thought were the different stakeholders in the system. And that included the payers, the physicians, the patients, academia, government, large business, small business. And at the center of all of that, we would have this slide, if I were up here, that we would show with FDA kind of at the center, because it actually touches all of those stakeholders in very profound ways. And yet, to me, one of the stakeholders that doesn't realize how much it's touched by FDA is academic and academic research itself. So one of the big disconnects that I see in the utilization of data and the promise of research is a fundamental disconnect between what's going on in basic research and what's going on at point of care, and what I call a lack of reverse engineering. So when I look at the data problem, and I worked very hard on this in the agency, I saw little to no deconstruction or reverse engineering of the knowledge that we already have in hand. So let's take clinical trials. The mountains of data that exists in clinical trials today, and how do we approach clinical development? Well, we go back to the next gene or the next new pathway or the next new promising molecule, and we try to predict and extrapolate out what's going to happen in patients, knowing that our failure rate with that process is somewhere around 96%. If you're really good, 92%, but most pharma's talking about what? Failure rates in the from target identification or lead identification out to product, it's pretty high failure.
Oh, very high.
Right?
Very high.
So we keep going back to this model, and that model in large part drives what the FDA does. It drives how we set up clinical trials. It drives a lot of the things that are in this system. I would propose that we need to do a little bit of deconstructing and reverse engineering, and I am a disruptor. So one thing that we could do is look at the data we have in hand. We have an enormous amount of information already in existence if we integrated the clinical trial experience to date I think we would understand a lot more about patient subsets. I think we would understand a lot more about placebo. I think we would understand a lot more about disease progression, because we even have control arms on standard of care. We could look at disease progression and we could say, how does that map to the total clinical experience? Can we come up with subsets based on data we already have in hand? I would propose we need to do that. I would also propose that we need to listen to patients and understand their experiences and perspectives from all the players in the healthcare system. I think one of the problems we have in drug development right now is the process. We take really great science, which is a good thing, we move it through this clinical development path where key opinion leaders define clinical trials, they define the regulatory framework, they define what the patient wants, and they don't ask the patient. And the patient is a human subject. They're not an engaged research participant. And this again goes to my concept of, let's reverse that a little bit. Let's try to understand what the end game is. What is the patient experience? What do patients care about? Make them engaged research partners in this process. And finally, just to bring this kind of home to the post-market surveillance situation, I think this is critical and part and parcel to us really being able to establish real-world efficacy. The problem that one of the major problems we have, and we looked hard at this while we were doing the PCAST study, was can we create a system where we have an indication, where we have a defined population and expand that indication in the post-market world based on efficacy in a system where post-market surveillance has been completely tooled and systematized to understand safety, which is a fundamentally different proposition. So can we retool the system to understand efficacy? I would argue yes, but not without understanding what's important to patients. I think there are vast opportunities now with electronic health records to understand that a little bit of that perspective. I think technology is going to be enabling to help us understand the patient perspective, but I also think we have to think hard about how we use some of the information we already have in hand to be smarter about how we do drug development. And the FDA actually could be very instrumental in doing that if the FDA could be transparent with the data that it has currently in its resources, but it can't. Because it's all of that data, all of that patient-level data is considered commercial confidential information. So I would wager that when people enter clinical trials, they do not necessarily believe, or nor would they like, that their data is locked up for eternity in a vault because it's considered commercial confidential information. I think we could make huge starts through transparencies and partnerships between academia, government, pharmaceutical companies, and patient organizations to really start to break open some of this stuff and get deeper understanding, and then begin to think about how we retool our clinical development process. Because the regulation, in large part, is reflecting a system that's been set up for a clinical development process based on a paradigm that I agree is antiquated. But we need to come up with the data to help us break through and get the science rigor that we need in order to justify how we can do things differently.
So Vicki, did you just tell us that one of the ways to get to the future is to look back?
I did.
Okay, which is intriguing and I think really interesting, but in order to do that well, there need to be some changes to the information. Then let me say also something that I think connected with all three of you is you pointed out that clinical trials are not real life and that we have, in real life use, we get a lot of information or could get a lot of information. And then there's this need, as Newt said, to take post-market surveillance and look not only at safety but at efficacy. You echoed that. I think, Marty, you confirmed that. How do we do that? What are some thoughts from each of you? How do we help FDA use the digital world in their life cycle product regulation to get more information in the post-market world to then bring it around to preclinical and to improving what we can provide to patients? What could we do there?
Well, I say a couple things. I want to start off by the telling you a statistic that maybe many of you know, but probably most of you don't. And that, as we talk about clinical trials and in the area of cancer, which has been a focus today, less than 5% of cancer patients actually participate in a clinical trial. Now, I would just say soak on that for a moment, because I think there's a fundamental problem if that is in fact the case. And it goes a bit to what Vicki stated in terms of the uneven care or uneven access. In fact, in Washington, some months ago, was with Nancy Davenport Ennis, who founded National Patient Advocacy Foundation. I was sitting down with her and asked her what keeps her up at night. This is a woman, cancer survivor, husband's a cancer survivor. She founded a lobbying organization, and I was surprised that her answer was the uneven access to clinical trials. This is something that needs to change, and I think in part it's a problem that's a group problem here. The regulator has put enough barriers such that the complexity of clinical trials to meet their standard of evidence and safety has gotten so complex that some sites in Tupelo, Mississippi may say, no, we're not going to do that, you know. And how can we use data and the connectivity of the data to allow people in Tupelo, Mississippi to get into clinical trials without having to travel 200 miles to get into that study. Likewise, I can tell you, I think we've got to look at other subpopulations, not just genetic, but racial and other demographics, which means that we need to begin to train up those from various groups to be PIs and to be investigators, because there's a significant lack there. If we are going to expand options for all patients or more patients and expand the database. I will say this, I think that, so I'm going to be a little bit counter on your, and then see if Marty and Vicki can help me. I think one of the things in this post-market surveillance that we have to be cautious about is misinterpretation of data. It's amazing, as excited as we all are to rush into, hey, look at this, we've got an N of 1 or N of 1,000 or N of 1 million on a study. You can make bad statistical inferences from data sets if you're not careful. And if we're looking at claims data, oftentimes very unreliable and not scrubbed. And this is a concern that we need to have as we're looking for positive signals of benefit as well as risk signals. So one of the things I would suggest as we go about this is we work on this idea of trust and collaboration, and that we don't have people, a man and a computer all of a sudden deciding, well, we've got this piece of information and it gets slung out into the data sphere and create some sort of furor. I think we've got to work together with people like Marty to ensure that, as I think he's commented on very nicely, where we're injecting science, not just into the mathematics, so that we're using interpretive understanding so that we don't lead people astray in one of those two ways. And so I do think a process of collaboration and trust and some review of it makes sense for the betterment of the public.
Marty?
Thanks. I think we're dealing with some conflicting phenomena. I think we'll still accept that the double-blind randomized controlled study will be the gold standard against which everything else is compared. But we have things we can do which come very close to that. And I guess it must be almost 4 years ago now, I was at a symposium at the NIH about the future of healthcare research. And they were commenting on this gold standard, the randomized controlled study. And most of the conversation was how difficult that was. And that in our contemporary world, there's a new difficulty. On top of everything else, they have found when they go through all that struggle of recruiting the researchers and recruiting the funding and getting the control group and the treatment group and initiating the study, then the patients go out onto the web and use social networks and somehow find others that are in the study and compare notes. And if they have somebody say, these 3 people are having this adverse effect and I'm not having anything, I must be in the control group, I'm going to drop out. And so the ability to create those studies is probably going to become more challenged. There was another studies a few years ago that the rigors of these studies are so demanding on the experimental group that they said 85% of physicians who participate in a controlled study do it only once. So of those phenomena. Now, in terms of like looking at the post-marketing arena, so you have a few goals in post-marketing. You want to make sure of the safety. And it usually requires information on lots of patients to do that. So for example, it was Kaiser Permanente in California that first recognized the problem with Vioxx and alerted the FDA based on studies of their own patients. Now they had 9 million some odd patients, whose records they could plumb for that information, but they were the first to detect increased incidence of myocardial infarction on patients taking Vioxx for the long term. So that was, a unique contribution on their part, but it also kind of identifies the stage in which we can do these things. So one of the analytic tools we have developed, we sometimes call patient similarity analytics. And what that does is describe your index patient, the patient you're dealing with right now, with many, many characteristics, not just, age, the typical demographics, but many characteristics, potentially thousands of characteristics that describe that patient. And then look in the population for which you have information, and ideally millions of patients, because a lot of the limitations on statistical analysis and inference can be mitigated by increasing the number of patients that you have, because things tend to balance out. Then look within that huge population for a cohort of patients that are very similar, and then look for differences in outcome. And some of our preliminary work is that this would be helpful in identifying the subpopulations that are most susceptible to the benefit or the adverse effect of the drug. Okay. Or find incidental things, like Dr. von Eschenbach mentioned a study yesterday on cancer therapy where it turned out the patients that responded were having to simultaneously be on vitamin B12 as well as the therapy, and they benefited when the others didn't. So if you identify these similar populations and subcohorts, it's a way of identifying complications earlier on, or the maybe ideally more important, the subgroup that really responds to the drug and allows you to find other opportunities for patients that don't respond to the drug. So I read two books recently, which kind of sort of reinforced and influenced my opinion on these things. One was Nate Silver's book on the signal and the noise. If you recall, Nate Silver is the political and baseball predictor. He predicted correctly 34 of 35 Senate races in the last election. And he wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise, okay, and talked about the limitations of statistical analysis and of prediction, and why most talking heads on these political talk shows are always wrong or substantially wrong, is they are modeling their predictions on what Silver called the noise and not the real signal. And that's always a danger in healthcare. And when you can come up with, as Newton referenced, statistical associations that aren't valid, it's because there's a lot of noise in your signal and you're modeling on the noise. So he also made the point that what makes your statistical inferences more valid is being able to demonstrate or come up with a mechanism, an explanation as to why this makes sense, say pharmacologically. What is the mechanism or the biophysical mechanism that would explain this association? And if you can create such a mechanism, you're more likely to have developed something that has causality rather than just a random statistical association. So I think that's another thing we need to look at. And in the context of his book, he referenced baseball and the weather, and that statistical models for weather prediction, working together with an experienced meteorologist, those two things together are 20% better than either alone. You're somebody who understands the mechanism, and the same thing in baseball. So we need that in healthcare. If we're going to do those studies, be able to come up with the mechanism, like the vitamin B12 being there, why that would have some impact. So we're going to deal with big data. We're going to have to do statistical analyses. Ideally, we want to get to the causality component, and so we're going to need to look at things in a variety of different ways if we're going to achieve that. But clearly in the post-marketing era, the goal, because many more people are going to be using the drug after it's marketed than the 300 or 1,000 that's used it before, and that 300 or 1,000 is going to be exposed to the drug for a very short period of time. We're missing a whole range of possibilities. We're going to need to look at things more broadly and take advantage of the people that want to share their data, overcome the resistance to sharing their data, because this clearly is big data stuff. The more patients we can look at, the better we'll do with that.
Yeah, great. Vicki, did you want to add anything?
Well, I agree with Newt on the caution that we have to approach post-market data with, and clearly claims databases is one area where we've have numerous examples of being misled. So I think that's important. I also agree with everything. I just taught a course actually for medical fellows, and we were talking, part of our slide deck was Nate Silver's book. So, and I think it is an important perspective that we need to introduce, is what are we actually measuring? And I think, to go back to my point about looking back, it goes to this issue of we have to connect the mechanism and the biology to the point of care. And we just aren't. And so there are some examples, and I think that where we are with clinical trials, it's not a perfect data set, it's not a great data set in terms of, sure, there was selection, but on aggregate, when you look at the experience of hundreds of thousands of patients in clinical trials, there may be things there that we could learn that would be helpful. So to sort of try to come back to the regulatory environment, I'm not sure that approaching this as an FDA problem is the answer. I think it's a system problem. I think there's a lot of misaligned incentives from all the stakeholders that are part of this system. I think, as we pointed out, there's not enough seamless connection between what's going on at the level of fundamental biology and what's actually going on in point of care in a more systematic way. And I think that when we look at some of the other drivers, and one of the things that has been left out of the conversation today, but that is ever present when you're working at the FDA, is not just the patient perspective, but the public perspective. And I don't think we can frame everything in terms of patients, because patients are patients at a certain point of time, but a lot of what's going on in terms of driving the risk-benefit calculus is really tied to the public perception, which has many dimensions. Media, politics, socioeconomic, different perspectives of different cultures, and probably underlying a lot of it is trust. And I think that there is not a fundamental trust necessarily in the system that we've constructed by the public. And so the end result of that is that you see when things go wrong, that's what you hear about. And you hear about it a lot. When things go right, you hear about it a little. So, you know, and when you're working at the FDA, that's a constant struggle, is what's the public? You know, what's the public perception? One more thing I would add is we're also speaking a lot about oncology, and we're talking about very innovative medicine, but a large part of what's consuming our healthcare costs is public health issues. And if we want to be able to introduce innovator products into what is, I think everyone can agree, a certain constrained budget for healthcare expenditures, we also need to look at that side of the equation. What is going on in public health right now? What is going on with obesity? What is going on with type 2 diabetes? What is going on in some of these lower socioeconomic strata? I would argue it's in all of our interests, all of the people involved in innovator drug development, to spend a little time and a little energy trying to solve some of those problems if we want to free up some of those dollars for the great medicines that we want to develop. Because those problems are consuming huge portions of our budget. We could go on about nutrition and food deserts and a variety of other things, but they're worth looking at because it's part of the ecosystem.
Great. We have time for just a couple questions if there are any from the audience. So the microphone there in the center.
Manfred Phillips, City University of New York. I haven't heard any mention of the effect of FDA regulation on the development of new antibacterials. We've heard reference to a wide variety of different disease states. Antibacterials hasn't really come up in any major way. Does FDA regulation currently have a negative effect on the development of antibacterials?
I mean, historically, there was a lot of discussion about endpoints and antibacterials, and I think that that's being addressed. I think one of the hard problems for novel antibiotics is also a market issue, which is you spend the same amount of money to develop the products, and if you have a really great antibiotic that's treating multi-drug resistant conditions, you're not a frontline therapy. So, you know, by definition, you're not a frontline therapy. So I think there are lots of, and plus, pile on top of that the overutilization. We could have a long discussion about what's going on at point of care with utilization of antibiotics. So there are many things that are complicated. I don't think there's one particular driver that's the problem. I also think, and I had an interesting conversation actually with Newt's chairman, John Leichletter, about this, who said, you know, it's not sexy science. We've scoured all the sewers from Sardinia and on, and we can't derivatize anymore what we got. We need some new stuff. And academia isn't giving us any new stuff because it's not like a cool new area of science. So, you know, we need to look at that part of the equation as well.
Question over there.
Yeah, regarding antibiotics, I write about this all the time. I used to do research in it. The pharmaceutical industry is not the pharmaceutical industry anymore. It's changed completely, largely because of the patent cliff, $70 billion in lost revenue. And the companies have done a 180, and this is not being taken into account in this discussion today. I hate to put a damper on the mood or anything, but drug companies are basically dropping out of small molecules, which include antibiotics, CNS agents, heart drugs, diabetes, and they're going to biologics, orphan drugs, and very expensive cancer drugs. And if you look at what was approved in 2012, that's just about everything. So when you couple that with the average of 30,000 jobs lost per year across the industry over the last decade, you're looking at a new reality. The reality is that drug companies cannot be counted on to do what they used to do because they're doing completely different work. And these new therapies that are theoretically going to be coming out, and then we can use genomics or whatever to take advantage of them, are not going to be coming out. I'm intimately involved with this. I lost my job as a research chemist. Everybody I know has. Really, the small molecule is a thing of the past, and that's really where you're going to need your work most. Not expensive biologics and not expensive cancer drugs and orphan drugs. So I had an editorial called The Coming Gonorrhea Epidemic, just come out recently. There's nothing to treat gonorrhea anymore.
Well, I think that's interesting, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation because certainly Newt could comment on this, but I think, and this is one of what I would consider an unanticipated consequence of the accelerated approval strategy, which is that you're right. Most of the new drugs that are being approved are targeted towards trying to capitalize on the accelerated approval pathways and the rare and orphan indication status. And that's great. It's great for rare and orphan diseases. It's great for the field of oncology. It's not so great for everything else. And it's, I think, symptomatic of partly disease definition and what we call unmet medical need, but it's also symptomatic of where the science is in terms of the ability to have a gene that equals a target in a rare and orphan disease and a gene that equals a target in a tumor, where, again, in the diseases I worked at, no gene equals any target in rheumatoid arthritis. So, you know, I think that's part of it is the science, and part of it is that we have a system that can take that science and kind of move it along rapidly, and everybody's sort of focusing on, okay, we can use this pathway, and we have the science in hand, so we can go really full steam ahead on that. We could have long conversations about patent cliffs, but Newt should.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and certainly the pharmaceutical company isn't the same industry that it was 4 decades ago, let's say, and I would argue it shouldn't be, right? I mean, we're going to have to change. You're correct in some of the things you stated. I'd like to maybe give a different perspective on one of the or two of the things you said, but for sure we're dealing with the outcome of Hatch-Waxman back from 1985. So the patent cliff that exists, and I can tell you our company's going through this in spades right now, so we're dealing with it, and the cuts that have had to ensue based upon losing patent and then not being able to rapidly and sufficiently replace those revenues for blockbuster drugs has caused the layoffs that you've identified. People often complain about pharmaceuticals as being rich companies that never fail or go bankrupt. Well, they actually do. They get bought by other companies. And if you look back in the mid-1970s or 80s when I came into the industry, there were tens more companies here in the U.S. Than there are today. And that's not a good thing. We need more diversity. Now, biotech has filled in for some of that, to be sure. But the facts are we're seeing those unintended consequences of Hatch-Waxman come into effect, and that's why there was so much work in terms of data package exclusivity around biologics and ensuring that we do have appropriate financial incentives to get people to invest in this. I will tell you that I don't think that you mentioned that we're moving away towards orphan drugs and maybe cancer and moving away from major diseases. That's patently false. And I'll tell you that we're spending a majority of our over $4 billion a year in R&D on cardiovascular disease, dyslipidemia, as well as diabetes, which is a chosen area for our focus, and autoimmune diseases that affect, a variety of autoimmune diseases that affect broad populations. Now, what is true that you did state is you've seen the mix of our portfolios move from small molecules almost exclusively or predominantly to a much more balanced mix between small and large molecules. And there's a variety of reasons. I mean, you've got naturally occurring proteins out there. We can understand those, and there may be a higher rate of success that we have with them. And also, we've exhausted the low-hanging fruit in small molecules through targets and combinatorial chemistry. I mean, we've revved that engine quite a few times. And so I think that mix is actually a good and healthy thing. But I can tell you, because of the opportunity for return, companies will continue to look for being able to solve, even if it's incremental benefits in large diseases like cardiovascular, diabetes, obesity, the ones that have been spoken about. And it does allow me just to state, although this is about FDA, there was a comment about CMS and diagnostics. We're entering into that fray. We want to try to see diagnostics appropriately reimbursed where we can. We think it is an ecosystem working together, and we're going to lobby on behalf of them to say that we'd like to see that reimbursement. We also think we ought to have a regime that does reward incremental innovation. I know everyone wants to see a breakthrough, but the truth is, whether you look in automobiles or information technology or biosciences, the best metaphor is we see dwarves standing on top of giants' shoulders. You see many incremental improvements punctuated by an occasional breakthrough. But the truth is, those incremental benefits make a big difference. And lung cancer is a perfect example. While it's still incurable, non-small cell lung cancer, a mere 15 years ago, survival was 8 months maybe. Now we're talking about, in certain trials, averages of 13, 14, 16 months, and in fact with large cohorts that are surviving 2 years. Having just buried my dad last year from lung cancer, I can tell you to have somebody survive 2 years versus 8 months is a big deal. It's a really big deal. And it may not sound like it to someone who's dispassionate and removed from it, but wait till you get lung cancer or one of your loved ones do, and you'll realize an extra 2 or 3 months on top of an extra 2 or 3 months, and now you get pretty excited about it. We've got to continue to look for ways to reward those kinds of incremental benefits as well as the big breakthroughs.
One more question, and then we'll wrap. So there's one here at the front table.
First of all, I really like Vicki's comment. The genomics a hype, there's no doubt about it. Because we can sequence many different cancers. We keep finding the same mutations. And then how many of them are really targetable? Only a very small fraction of it. Okay, so, and how many of them will actually cure them? Very small amount. So the problem at this moment, it's very important to go back to see what happened in the past. Lots of the trials failed because they only see 3%, 5% difference. But those 5% patients actually benefit from it.
Exactly.
And those drugs are not really, what we need to do is retool, to repurpose some of the drugs that we know before and how to develop. But the problem is that having said that, we cannot just stay here and say, okay, there's going to generate lots of data that we're not going to deal with it. But just like to Marty's point, so the future, what's going to happen is 5 to 10 years from now, everybody's going to have a chip of all the data they need. And it's just like a CT scan 10, 20 years ago. Nobody's doing it. It's $3 billion for a human genome 10 years ago. Now it's $3,000. That's the fact. So everybody's going to get all the information. So the problem is that how we're going to generate the data, like level 1 data, that's very precision data, and level 2 data, that's all the community data. So what's needed to do is the level 1 data to be very concisely, controlled and to predict what's really going on. Then you can utilize those information. In terms of the problem at this moment is for drug company, is the drug is $20,000 for 30 days. Each patient take one pill is $700. So this problem is that the insurance company is not going to pay for it, so who is going to pay for it? So the problem is you need to have a much better way of predicting what patients to be on what drugs, and insurance company and drug company and government should work together to provide, when it's under test or hypothesis-driven protocol, whatever, that drug needs to be provided very cheap, not like $20,000 for that we know that it will work.
Well, there's a lot in there. And I don't want to minimize the importance of the human genome and genetic testing by any means. I think it's been a really miraculous development. I think, and we were talking about this, that I agree with you. Ideally, everyone will have their human genome, and that'll be sort of just baseline information that you know about yourself that will need to be connected again to those phenotypes. And that seems to me to be where the hard work needs to be done and hasn't been done to date. So coming back to what I was saying, how do we use technology? How do we create a system where we're connecting point of care with biology? And what we're considering now might be a baseline of understanding the genome, the genetic sequence of each individual in the system. I think, I mean, I don't know, I can't, the cost issue, is partly a market issue, and it's a complicated one because there's huge amounts of money being invested to bring these drugs to market, and people have to get a return on their investment, and that's why you're seeing the list price where it is. I think we're seeing that that's going to be challenging for healthcare systems that have limited budgets. We've already seen some of that in what's going on in the UK and Germany, for example. This is a challenge. We have to work hard, I think, to drive down costs of clinical trials and streamline things, and that's part of what the conversation is about today. But we also have to recognize that these are complex molecules, and they're expensive to develop. So I don't. This is a very complicated topic. We could go on for hours, and I don't think we have that much time. I don't know, Newt, I should let you close on that one.
No, I kind of agree. It's a different panel to talk about drug pricing, which is very controversial, and I appreciate your comments. And we're tuned in to the recent article in Blood by a number of doctors and cancer agent cost, and I want to say we're sensitive to that, but it is something that deserves probably more than a 30-second answer. Mm-hmm.
In the pipeline, you should open those drugs in a clinical trials, very cheap way. And there's no cost to your company because you're producing those for the trials. For example, CTAP is a very good example. So I think what you need to do is most of the drug companies should dump their drugs to CTAP and then have CTAP to conduct clinical trials, and that way the clinical trial they can combine. But the problem is it will be very difficult to have Eli Lilly and Novartis to work together on some of the drugs. But the government agency, the CTAP, they can do that. It's drugs, just dump it to them. And then we should be able to design more sophisticated trial. And there's no cost to the development. Actually save you money because I'm not talking about approved drug. I'm talking about drug in the pipeline.
Right.
So that's probably a good thing to point out, that it proves Marty's point that we're in it's a contextual problem and not just a piece that is fixed in FDA is fixed in payment or fixed even in public behavior and patient perception. So we all have a lot of work to do, but first need to eat lunch. So join me in thanking our panel for robust discussion.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.